Reggie here, and I want to welcome you to another one of my videos. I recently had a subscriber ask me a question that I could not answer. And the question that this person had is, why is there a value delta between 9.8s and 9.6s? And I honestly could not answer this question. There is definitely a value delta, and we all see it, but the question is, why is it there? I've honestly just accepted that the delta exists and I've moved on. I've never really questioned it or dug into it. But because this person asked the question and I didn't really have an answer, I felt obligated to think a little bit about it and to do some research. And I will tell you that I found some things, but I don't have all the answers. And so I wanted to create this video to share with you my thoughts and what I've found, but also to solicit your ideas as well. So I definitely want to encourage you to sound off in the comment section. Let me know what you think. And from that, hopefully we can all learn a little bit. If you haven't yet subscribed to the channel, I definitely want to encourage you to do so because the channel's mission is to help make you smarter about the hobby of comic book collecting. With that said, let's get to the video. So as you heard in that brief intro, I want to take some time to think about the value delta that exists between 9.8s and 9.6s. And there is some data that we're going to look at a little bit later in this video that I definitely want to get your opinion of. But one of the first things that readily came to mind, and you would probably agree with this, is that our hobby is very subjective. Subjective in a lot of different ways. And specifically with grading, it is absolutely subjective. Yes, there is some science to grading a comic, but there is also an artistic side to it as well. There's also the human error element where somebody is having to visually inspect these comics and make a decision as to whether this defect is a 9.8 type of defect or a 9.6 type of defect. And so again, you could have a hair's difference between those two. And to that point, a 9.8 is not a perfect comic. A 9.8 can actually have defects present. And you could have a 9.6 that has defects that might actually look better than a 9.8. So there is a lot of blurring of the lines when it comes to 9.8s versus 9.6s. And to that point of defects, we have to acknowledge the fact that not all 9.8s are created equally. There are a lot of defects that are permissible in a 9.8. You could have a comic that is miscut or one that has off-white pages versus one that is perfectly centered with perfectly white pages. And we as collectors potentially will place more value on that perfectly cut comic with the white pages versus the other 9.8 that is a little misaligned that may have off-white to white pages. It goes back to the subjectivity and where we as collectors will choose to place value. One of the other things that we have to think about is that there is some personal value that comes from having a 9.8. Being able to show a 9.8 on social media, being able to hang a 9.8 on the wall. There is some personal value that we place upon having the best comic that there is. And because of that, that might be part of the reason why there is a value delta between the 9.8 and the 9.6, because of the perception that the 9.8 is perfect, that it is the pinnacle, it is the best. And many of us want the best. As collectors, we kind of sort of aim for that. And I have to mention that this is not something that takes away from a 9.6 or a 9.4 or a 9.2, right? They're all good books. Let's remember that. They're all great comics regardless of the grade. But a lot of times there's that internal thing that drives us to get that 9.8 so that we can have the best of the best. And sometimes that comes with us having to hand over a little bit more money for that book. The last point that I want to make before I actually get to some data is the notion of perceived rarity of that comic because it is a 9.8. Because many of us perceive the 9.8 to be the pinnacle, we believe that book to be rare, right? Yes, there are higher grades. There are 9.9s and there are 10s, but the reality is that we don't really see those books. Those books truly are rare. So for the vast majority of us, the 9.8 becomes the top of the grading pinnacle. And that's kind of what we're aiming for. And we perceive that 9.8 to be a rare book, a harder to find book. And the question is it? Is that part of the reason why we are handing over more money for the 9.8 versus a 9.6, which, as I mentioned, is also a really good book? That is what prompted me to dig into some data, and I began to look at the census for both CGC and also CBCS to see if there was something there. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at a couple of examples. And I want to start things off with a really awesome book, that being Amazing Spider-Man issue number 300, the first full appearance of Venom. Really awesome book. And I think there's some interesting things here in the data when we start to look at it. And what I decided to do was to really focus on the Universal Blue Label, right? The Blue Label comics, not signed books, not other labels, but Universal Blue Label and also Direct Edition. And what we see here is that there are 26,352 Blue Labels that have been graded by CGC, which is a ton of books overall. But when you look here at the census count, great thing about Go Collect is that they're integrated into CGC. We can see that there are only 1,381 9.8s on the entire census, right? That is a relatively small number of books when you consider the total number of Universal Blue Label that happen to be out there. And so I thought it was important to kind of look at that. But let's click on this and let's look at this data just a little bit closely. And I'm going to kind of go back and forth and toggle through some things. But again, there are 1,381 out of 26,000. There are 10 books that are graded higher, right? There are some 10.0s, I think 10.0s on the census that go a little bit higher than the 9.8. So there is something out there that is above it, but this is the top 5.3% of books, the top 5.3% of books. Again, that would say that this book is relatively rare at a 9.8. And it's important to point that out because we're trying to use some data to sort out why this is the case. And again, you can see the 9.9s, there are 10 of them. There's only been one sale, and that book went back in 2017 for a crazy amount of money. But as you look at the data, again, what you see here is a relatively small census number for the 9.8. You can see the FMV, and again, we'll just focus on the high level numbers here. FMV of $4,200. When you look at the 9.6, the census count more than doubles. The census count more than doubles as you go from the 9.8 to the 9.6. The value also comes down dramatically. So potentially, there is something to be said for a book that has a relatively small census count when you consider the overall. So that's important. What I also decided to do was I decided to look at the CBCS data. And I'm not going to show you that data, but you'll have to trust me. I pulled that data up, and what I found was that CBCS had graded an additional 784 essentially blue labels. 784 additional blue labels, and only 17 of them were 9.8. So when you add up all the numbers, right, you are still between CGC and CBCS, you're talking about roughly 30,000 books, right? The true number is 27,136. That is the true number of total blue labels that are out there graded. And the total number of books that are 9.8 of that is only 1,398, or 5%. 5%. And so potentially that is why we see a value delta here between the 9.8 and the 9.6, because the 9.8 is a pretty rare book when you consider the overall total. So I want to show another example that I think to some degree or another conforms to that notion. And you'll see what I mean here in a second. I wanted to get an older book, right? This is from 1980. This is Moon Knight issue number 1, first self-titled series for Moon Knight. And when we look at some of the data here, what we can see, let me make that a little bit larger for you, is that there are 9,974 universal blue labels that are out there. And of those, there's 1,124 that happen to be a 9.8. So again, a relatively small number of books. And when you look at the 9.6, you can see that the census count more than doubles again. And you see the value here. FMV for the 9.8, $375. The FMV for the 9.6, $140. But let's click on it. Let's click on the 9.8 and drill a little bit deeper and see what we see there. And you can see again here, let me zoom a little bit smaller. What we see here is some interesting stuff. The 9.8 is the highest graded book on the census. There are no 9.9s or 10s. The highest is the 9.8, and those are limited in number, right? We already spoke about that, 1,125. This is the top 11.3% of graded books. That says something, right? We have 5% roughly with ASM 300 and now 11.3 for Moon Knight issue number 1. I did the same thing. I went to the CBCS database and I looked up again, basically the blue label direct edition. They had graded an additional 425 total copies across the board, across all grades. Only 42% of them, or I'm sorry, only 42 of them, about 10% happen to be 9.8. So when you do the math on that, you are talking about between CGC and CBCS, a total of 10,380 graded books that are universal blue label and 1,166 of them that happen to be a 9.8, or 11% of those books happen to come back at a 9.8. Again, a relatively small number of books. And that could be why you see a value delta between the 9.8 and the 9.6. Now, admittedly, the value delta is not as great here as what we saw with ASM 300, but we also see a much smaller number of books here. And let's be honest, Moon Knight is not as popular as Amazing Spider-Man, as Venom, or Todd McFarlane. So that potentially could be part of it. And this book, it also is not as rare, right? It's 11% versus 5% of a very popular character. That could be part of the reason. Again, not to take anything away from Moon Knight. People love Moon Knight, which is perfectly fine. So I have a few more examples that I want to look at that don't quite conform as neatly as what we just saw. So I want to look at that, and there may be some of what I spoke about earlier, this personal satisfaction with owning a 9.8 that could be attributing to why people are choosing to pay a little bit more for certain books. But I'll look to you all to give me your thoughts as to why that might be the case. I love the Century, and I recently read a bunch of Century stuff just because I had a hankering to revisit it. And so this book came out in 2000. I have a couple of 9.8s of this myself that were from my original collection and also from a collection that I acquired. A couple of really awesome books. And you know, a 9.8 of a black cover is not an easy thing, but we see a much, much smaller census count here. We only see a total of 1,241 universal books out there. Of that number, 459 are a 9.8 and 407 are a 9.6. So again, almost a similar number between the 9.8 and the 9.6. Yet, look at the FMV. The FMV is very different. You have one that is almost, that is basically $450 and another that is below $200. Let's drill in. Let's look at this one. Now, a little something different here. The 9.8 is the highest graded again. There is no 9.9, there is no 10. Potentially, there is something to be said for this being the highest graded, and that's why, because when you look at it, this is the 9.8 represents the top 37%, the top 37% of graded books. So a bigger portion of these books happen to be a 9.8, but you're also looking at the highest grade, and you're also looking at a relatively small number overall of books that happen to be graded. this does not necessarily conform, but maybe there's some learnings there for us to observe. So let's look at another example, and these next couple are interesting examples. I do believe we're going to look at a really popular book, a book that has seen its value skyrocket over the last couple of years and then come down a little bit here. Ultimate Fallout issue number 4, first appearance of Miles Morales. I do not have a 9.8 of this. I think I have a 9.6, which is more than fine for me. But when you look at this one, what we see is that there are 14,449 universal blue labels that are out there. And when you look at the census count, 3,700 of them happen to be a 9.8 and 4,100 happen to be a 9.6. And you can see, again, a value delta that exists between those two. And then when you click on it, what we see is that this is the highest graded. Again, maybe there's some consistency there. There are no 9.9s, no 10s. The 9.8 is it. And there's, a relatively small number of them out there. But this one is the top 25 or top 26% of what is actually out there. And again, big value delta between the 9.8 and the 9.6. Is it worth it? I don't know. I don't know if it's worth it. I think these are things that we're going to have to consider for ourselves. Arguably, one of the more popular modern characters that exist. Maybe there is some subjectivity here as to why people are choosing to pay a lot of money for the 9.8. Maybe there's some speculation there. I don't know. I don't know the answers. But again, this is all interesting data, I think, for us to consider. One last example that I'll show you. Again, an incredibly popular character, incredibly popular creator. Spawn issue number 1, first appearance of Al Simmons, aka Spawn, and some other folks. This is issue number 1. And over here, you can see that there are a lot of copies of this book, 22,000 copies of this book out there. And what you'll notice is that there are 6 perfect 10s, 6 perfect 10s, and 69 9.9s, and potentially that affects what we see when we start to look at the data. Same thing here. The census count, the 9.8 is not exactly a rare book. 10,000 9.8s out of 22,000. That's a lot. But you can see a value delta here. Should there be a value delta? I don't know. So let's click on it and let's take a look at it and see what we see here. What we find is that this is the top 47%. The top 47% of books graded happen to be a 9.8. That is a lot. That is a lot. And when you look a little bit more, you can see that there are 75 graded copies that are higher than the 9.8. Is it worth it? Is it worth it to have the 9.8 here? I honestly don't know. Again, is there more at play here because of the popularity of Todd McFarlane, the fact that it's, Spawn and people are huge fans of Spawn, the potential that people are speculating with Todd teasing for the last several years that there's going to be a movie. I don't know. I don't know the answers. But again, I find some of this data to be interesting, and maybe there are some common themes that we're seeing here that will allow us to better understand why a 9.8 is more valuable, if you will, sells for more than a 9.6. And maybe what we've seen is some instances where that shouldn't necessarily be the case. Data can be your friend. Let's just say that data can be your friend, but you have to take the time to actually dig into it, to look at it, to make sure that you understand what's happening before you hand over some cash. And this is just me taking a shot on goal by looking at this data. I think additional analysis is encouraged or needed for us to really come to any definitive conclusions. But with that said, I am going to wrap this video up. I want to thank you for taking the time to watch. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope that you will sound off down in the comment section and let me know what you think about this data. Can you draw some conclusions from what you saw, or do we need to dig a little bit deeper? If you need to reach out to me, feel free to do so on Instagram at Regie Collects. Take care.